The paper felt foreign in Callum's hand, too thin and fragile against the calloused landscape of his palm. He held the letter from the placement agency in St. Louis, his thumb resting on the unbroken wax seal. The sun was not yet a rumor on the eastern horizon, but he was already up, the familiar ache in his lower back a testament to a life lived on the unforgiving terms of the land. He stood on the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, a solitary figure against the vast, sleeping expanse of the Wyoming Territory. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. He slit the envelope with his pocket knife, the movement economical and precise, like all his movements. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the neat, looping script. Miss Evelyn Rowe, arriving Tuesday, October 14th, Train 4, Laramie Station. He read the words without a flicker of expression. There was no anticipation. No flutter of hope or nervousness. This was not a matter of the heart. It was a transaction, a practical solution to a practical problem. The ranch was too much for one man to run. He needed a woman to manage the house, to cook the meals, to mend the clothes, to bring a semblance of order to the chaos of his solitary existence. A wife, the agency had called it. He called it hiring help. Love was a luxury he had buried long ago with his brother, Daniel, under a pile of rocks on a cattle drive gone wrong. Guilt was a more constant companion. He folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, the paper crinkling against his chest. He looked out at his land, the rolling, wind-blasted hills and the dry scrublands that stretched to forever. This place demanded everything a person had to give: sweat, blood, and sanity. It was no place for a delicate flower. But the agency had assured him Miss Evelyn Rowe was a widow, a woman who understood loss, a woman who would not come expecting poetry and promises. That suited Callum just fine. He had no poetry left in him. All he had to offer was a roof, food, and the stark, lonely truth of this life. He turned, his boots scuffing against the rough-hewn planks of the porch, and headed for the barn. The horses needed tending. The sun would be up soon, and the day wouldn't wait for any man, or any mail-order bride. The train journey had been a relentless assault on the senses. For 3 days, Evelyn had been rattled and shaken in the cramped, soot-stained car, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant, deafening drum against her frayed nerves. The world outside the grimy window was a blur of brown and gray, a landscape as desolate as the one inside her soul. She sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched in the lap of her plain, dark wool dress, a statue of carefully constructed composure. But inside, she was trembling. When the train finally screeched to a halt at Laramie Station, the sudden stillness was almost as jarring as the noise had been. She stepped down onto the platform, her legs unsteady, clutching a single, battered valise that held all her worldly possessions. The Wyoming air was a shock, so dry and thin it felt sharp in her lungs. The man waiting for her stood apart from the small cluster of people greeting the train. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty denim and worn leather. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship, not laughter. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "Miss Rowe?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. She could only nod, her throat tight with a fear she could not name. It was the fear of all men, a terror that had been branded into her by her late husband, Abel. He took the valise from her grasp without another word. His hand brushed hers, and she flinched, pulling back as if burned. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He simply turned and led the way to a mud-splattered buckboard wagon hitched to a pair of sturdy-looking horses. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the sky above. The ride to the ranch only deepened her sense of isolation. They left the small, dusty town behind, and soon there was nothing but the endless, undulating land. The hills were stark and barren, dotted with skeletal-looking shrubs that clawed at the dry earth. The wind was a constant, mournful presence. whipping strands of her pale brown hair from the tight bun at the nape of her neck and throwing dust into her eyes. This was not the green, gentle Ohio she had known. This was a different world, a harsher planet. She saw no other homes, no sign of life besides a hawk circling high overhead. It was a place where a person could disappear, and no one would ever know. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. Was this a sanctuary, or was it just a different kind of cage? The homestead, when they finally reached it, was as stark as the land it occupied. A small log cabin, a formidable-looking barn, and a corral were the only structures, huddled together as if for protection against the immense emptiness. The cabin was solid, built to withstand the elements, but there was nothing soft or welcoming about it. No flowers in a window box, no curtains on the windows, no paint on the door. It was a shelter, not a home. Callum brought her valise inside. The interior was dark and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. It consisted of a single main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a small area for cooking. 2 doors led off the main room. "The kitchen is here," he said, gesturing to the stove and shelves. "Water is from the well out back. The privy is behind the barn." He pointed to one of the doors. "This is your room." He set her valise down just inside the doorway, but did not enter. She peered into the small space, a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single wooden peg on the wall for her clothes. It was monastic in its simplicity, but it was a room of her own, a door that could be closed, a space that was hers. The relief was so profound it almost buckled her knees. Their first meal together was a tense, silent affair. He had heated up a can of beans and fried some bacon. He ate quickly, methodically, his gaze fixed on his plate. Evelyn's stomach was a tight knot of anxiety, and she could only manage a few bites, pushing the food around her plate. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the scrape of his fork and the whistle of the wind outside. He didn't ask about her journey. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't ask her anything at all. That night, Evelyn lay in the narrow bed, her body rigid with a familiar dread. She listened to every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind, her ears straining for the sound of his footsteps approaching her door. In her marriage to Abel, the nights had been the worst. He had seen her as his property, a thing to be used for his pleasure and his temper. He would come to her, his breath soured with whiskey, and take what he wanted, leaving her feeling broken and soiled. She braced herself for the same here. This man, Callum, had paid for her passage. He had, in essence, bought her. She expected him to claim his purchase. But the footsteps never came. The only sounds were the lonely cry of the wind and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. She lay awake for hours, waiting, until the sheer weight of her exhaustion finally pulled her into a shallow, restless sleep. She rose before dawn, the habit of making herself useful deeply ingrained. She found Callum already gone. A pot of coffee was warming on the stove, a silent offering. A profound and bewildering sense of confusion washed over her. He had not touched her. He had not demanded anything of her. He had given her a room of her own and left her in peace. It was so contrary to her experience that she didn't know how to process it. She began to clean, the familiar motions a balm to her agitated mind. She swept the rough plank floors, dusted the sparse furniture, and scrubbed the pots until they shone. Work was a shield. It was a way to make herself small, to earn her keep, to be invisible. As she worked, memories, sharp and unwanted as shards of glass, surfaced. She remembered Abel's face, handsome at first, but twisted by a cruelty that lived just beneath the surface. She remembered the day she had told him she was with child, the flicker of pride in his eyes that was more about possession than joy. And she remembered the aftermath of the fall down the stairs, the blood, the cramping pain that was nothing compared to the hollowing agony of the loss that followed. The doctor had called it a miscarriage. Abel had called it a failure. Her failure. Useless. He had spat at her, his voice thick with contempt as she lay grieving in their bed. Can't even do the one thing a woman is good for. His words had been a constant barrage, chipping away at her until she felt worthless, a broken vessel. The physical blows were almost easier to bear than the relentless shame he heaped upon her. He shamed her for her tears, shamed her for her silence, shamed her for the empty space in her womb. When she heard he had been killed in a bar fight over a card game, she had not shed a single tear. She had felt a terrifying, liberating wave of nothingness. She packed her small valise and fled, taking the first train heading west, away from the whispers and the pitying looks of the townspeople, away from the ghost of the man who had tried to erase her. Days settled into a quiet, tentative routine. Evelyn cooked and cleaned, washed and mended. Callum was gone from sunrise to sunset, working the ranch with a relentless, single-minded focus. He was a man who seemed more comfortable with horses and cattle than with people. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. He never entered her room, never crossed the invisible line she had drawn around herself. He would leave firewood stacked by the door and hang fresh cuts of meat on a hook outside. He treated her with a detached, almost formal respect that was more foreign to her than any kindness. One evening, after a particularly long and grueling day, she heard a sound from the barn. At first, she thought it was an animal in distress, but as she listened, a chill ran down her spine. It was the sound of a man crying, not a loud, unrestrained sobbing, but a quiet, ragged grief, as if the sound was being torn from his throat against his will. She stood frozen in the cabin doorway, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. She knew it was Callum. The stoic, unreadable rancher was in the barn, weeping in the dark. The sound was so full of pain it resonated with her own buried sorrow. She did not go to him. She would not have known what to say, and she felt that his grief, like hers, was a private, sacred thing. But in that moment, she saw past his hardened exterior. He was not just a stoic stranger. He was a man carrying a heavy burden. He was broken, too. The knowledge changed something in her. The next evening at supper, the silence felt a little less heavy. "The stew is good," he said gruffly, not looking at her. It took her a moment to find her voice. It came out as a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Thank you." It was a start. A few days later, as she struggled to haul a heavy bucket of water from the well, he appeared at her side and took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. "The well is getting low," she managed to say, her eyes fixed on the ground. "It'll rain," he replied, his voice flat. They were not conversations. Not really. They were exchanges of fact, statements of observation. But for Evelyn, each word she spoke felt like a small act of rebellion against the silence that Abel had imposed on her. One morning, she was frying bacon for breakfast, her mind 1,000 miles away, lost in a fog of memory. She reached for the cast-iron skillet, forgetting the cloth holder, and her palm closed around the searingly hot handle. A sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips, and she dropped the skillet with a loud clatter. Callum was across the room in 2 strides. Before she could react, he grabbed her hand and plunged it into the bucket of cool water she kept by the stove. The shock of the cold was as startling as the burn itself. Her first instinct was to fight, to rip her hand from his grasp. Her entire body went rigid, a full-body recoil from the sudden, unexpected touch of a man. "Hold still," he commanded, his voice firm but not angry. His grip was strong, but it was not brutal. He held her wrist, his thumb pressing gently against her frantic pulse. His other hand supported her elbow. His focus was entirely on her burned hand, submerged in the water. He was not looking at her with anger or desire, but with a quiet, intense concentration. He was helping. The realization was a shock to her system. The terror that had seized her began to recede, replaced by a bewildering stillness. Her muscles, which had been coiled tight to flee, slowly began to relax. For the first time in years, she allowed a man to touch her, and she did not pull away. He held her there for a long time, in silence, until the fire in her hand subsided to a dull throb. That night, Evelyn's sleep was deeper than it had been in years, but it was not peaceful. She dreamed of her baby. In the dream, he was alive, a warm, solid weight in her arms. She could smell the sweet, milky scent of his skin and feel his tiny fingers curled around hers. She felt a joy so pure and fierce it was painful. She looked down at his face, wanting to memorize every detail, but his features began to blur, and he grew lighter in her arms, fading, dissolving into mist. She tried to hold on to him, her fingers closing on empty air. A desperate cry tearing from her throat. She woke up to the sound of her own ragged sobs, her cheeks wet with tears, the phantom weight of her child still aching in her arms. The grief she had held at bay for so long came crashing down on her, a tidal wave of sorrow that left her gasping for breath. She curled into a tight ball, the sobs shaking her small frame. She heard the floorboards creak outside her room. Her sobs caught in her throat, replaced by a fresh spike of fear. He had heard her. He was coming, but the doorknob didn't turn. The door remained closed. She held her breath, listening. She could sense him, just on the other side of the thin wooden barrier. He was just standing there, a silent, unmoving presence in the dark. He wasn't intruding, wasn't demanding she be quiet. He was simply there, a guardian at the gate of her sorrow. His silent vigil gave her a strange kind of permission to grieve. The sobs returned, softer this time, a river of quiet tears for the child she had lost, for the woman she had been, for the love she had never known. When the last of the tears were spent, a profound and weary calm settled over her. The cabin was silent again, save for the ever-present wind. She knew he was still there, standing guard, in the deep, dark quiet of the Wyoming night. She whispered to the closed door, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Spring arrived in Wyoming not as a gentle thaw, but as a change in the character of the harshness. The sun, a pale, distant cousin through the winter months, now beat down with a surprising ferocity, baking the already cracked earth into a network of fine, intricate lines. The wind, relentless and cold, did not cease but carried with it a new, finer grade of dust that settled on everything, coating the inside of the cabin with a perpetual gritty film. Water, always a concern, became a preoccupation. The well grew shallower by the day, each bucket of brackish water hauled up from its depths a more strenuous and precious victory. Evelyn struggled. The life she had known, a life of indoor chores and soft hands, had not prepared her for this. The constant work of running the homestead was a brutal education. Her hands, once pale and smooth, were now a roadmap of her daily battles, blistered from the lye soap and the rough handle of the well crank, crisscrossed with small cuts from chopping kindling. Her skin, perpetually shielded from the sun in Ohio, was now often sunburned, a painful, angry red across her cheeks and the back of her neck, despite the worn sunbonnet she always wore. She was leaner than when she'd arrived, the meager softness of her frame worn away by labor, leaving a sinewy toughness she did not recognize in herself. Yet, she did not complain. She worked from the first hint of light until her body ached with a fatigue so deep it felt as if it had settled in her bones. The physical pain was a distraction, a tangible reality that kept the ghosts of her past at bay. Their fragile truce, born in the shared quiet of her nighttime grief, held fast. Conversations were still sparse, but they were no longer stilted. He would tell her if a storm was rolling in from the west, and she would tell him they were running low on flour. They existed in a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a silent partnership of necessity. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the solid, reassuring sound of his boots on the porch at the end of the day. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it had retreated, like a timid animal, to the dark corners of her mind. Once a month, they made the long, jarring trip into Laramie for supplies. It was a journey Evelyn had come to dread, The town was a cacophony of noise and people, a stark contrast to the profound silence of the ranch. On one such trip, while Callum was negotiating the price of salt blocks with the liveryman, Evelyn went into the general store with their carefully compiled list. The store was a dim, crowded space that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. As she waited for the proprietor to weigh out a sack of beans, she became aware of two women standing near the fabric bolts, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur. "That's her," one of them whispered, a stout woman with a face like a disgruntled pudding, the one Callum Blackwood ordered from a catalog. "Mercy," the other, a thinner woman with sharp, bird-like eyes, replied. "Looks like a strong wind would blow her over. And those eyes, she looks haunted." "They say she's a widow. Damaged goods. If you ask me, no respectable woman would travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger. There's a story there, and I'd wager it isn't a pretty one." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. The women's words were like physical blows, striking the most vulnerable, bruised parts of her soul. Damaged goods. The phrase echoed Abel's taunts, his cruel assessments of her worth after she had lost their child. She felt the familiar, suffocating cloak of shame settle over her. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the floorboards. She kept her back to them, her shoulders rigid, and prayed for the proprietor to hurry. When he finally handed her the sack of beans, she paid with trembling fingers, not daring to meet his gaze, and fled the store, the women's quiet, cruel laughter following her out into the dusty street. She climbed onto the buckboard and sat staring straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. When Callum returned, he took one look at her pale, set face, and his own expression hardened. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply loaded the supplies and climbed up beside her, his silence a heavy, questioning presence. The ride home was excruciating. Every jostle of the wagon felt like an accusation. When they were nearly back to the ranch, he pulled the horses to a stop. "What happened in the store?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He waited a moment, then clucked to the horses and they started again. As soon as they reached the homestead, Evelyn slid from the wagon and hurried into the cabin, into the sanctuary of her room, and closed the door. There, in the dim, quiet space, she finally broke. The tears she had refused to shed in town came in a hot, silent torrent. She pressed her face into her thin pillow, muffling the sobs that tore through her. She was damaged. She was broken. They were right. And he, Callum, had been saddled with her. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She did not know how long she cried, but eventually, the storm of grief subsided, leaving her hollowed out and exhausted. She heard Callum moving around in the main room, the heavy, deliberate sounds of him putting away the supplies. She expected him to knock, to demand an explanation, but he left her alone. The next morning, she emerged from her room, her eyes swollen and raw. He was sitting at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked at her, his gaze steady and direct. "We're going back to town," he said. It was not a question.
"No,"
she whispered, her voice hoarse.
"I don't want to."
"We're going," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The ride back to Laramie was charged with a tense, unspoken energy. Evelyn sat beside him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach with every mile. What was he going to do? Confront the women? Make a scene? The thought of any more attention, any more public scrutiny, was mortifying. When they arrived, he didn't stop at the general store. He pulled the wagon up in front of the saloon, where a group of men were loitering on the boardwalk, sharing a morning drink and idle gossip. He got down from the wagon. "Stay here," he said to Evelyn. He walked directly up to the men. They quieted as he approached, sensing the cold, dangerous aura that emanated from him. Callum was not a man to be trifled with, and the entire town knew it. He singled out two of the men known for their loose tongues and cruel humor. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in a low, level tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Evelyn was too far away to hear the exact words, but she could see the effect they had. The men's smirks vanished, replaced by looks of unease, then fear. One of them started to say something, a placating gesture, but Callum took a single step forward, and the man fell silent. Callum's gaze moved from one man to the next, a silent, deadly warning. He stood there for a long moment, letting his unspoken threat settle, before he turned his back on them and walked away. He climbed back onto the wagon, his face an unreadable mask of stone, and turned the horses for home. He had not laid a hand on anyone. He had not made a scene, but he had drawn a line in the dust of Laramie, and no one would dare to cross it. Evelyn watched the entire exchange, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had never been defended before. Abel had been the source of her humiliation, not her protector. To see this quiet, solitary man stand up for her name, shook her to her very core. He had shielded her, had claimed her as his own in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or bargains. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of the day's events. As he sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, he finally spoke. "Do you regret coming here, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. She looked at him, at his strong, calloused hands, at the deep-set sadness in his eyes. She thought of the whispers in the store, the endless work, the crushing loneliness of the land. But then she thought of the safety of her own room, of his quiet acts of provision, of the fierce, protective anger she had seen in his eyes that afternoon. She couldn't answer. The truth was too complicated, a tangled knot of pain and a fragile, emerging hope. She simply shook her head, unable to form the words. Later that night, long after she had retired to her room, she heard him shift in his chair by the dying fire. She knew he often fell asleep there, too tired or too haunted to seek his own bed. Quietly, she rose and took the spare wool blanket from the foot of her bed. She crept into the main room. He was slumped in the chair, his head resting against the high back, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him. Even in sleep, he looked wary, as if he could never fully let his guard down. She hesitated for a moment, then gently, carefully, she draped the folded blanket over his shoulders, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. She retreated back to her room, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, a quiet act of care offered in return for one she had never expected. A few days later, an idea began to take root in Evelyn's mind. Behind the cabin, there was a small patch of ground that was somewhat protected from the wind. The soil was hard and rocky, but it was the best they had. She decided she would plant a garden. The thought of creating something, of nurturing life in this barren place, was a balm to her spirit. She started by clearing the rocks, her blistered hands aching with the effort. She used a shovel to turn the hard, compacted soil, her back screaming in protest. It was grueling, thankless work. Callum watched her from a distance for the first 2 days, his expression unreadable. On the third day, as she struggled to pry a particularly large, stubborn rock from the earth, he appeared at her side. He didn't say a word. He simply took the iron bar from her, wedged it under the rock, and with a single, powerful heave, lifted it from the ground. He rolled it to the edge of the patch and then walked away, leaving her to her work. From then on, he helped in his own quiet way. He would leave a sharpened hoe by the plot in the morning or appear with 2 heavy buckets of water in the evening when he saw her struggling. He never offered advice, never took over. He respected that it was her creation. She found some seeds in the supply sacks, beans, squash, and some hardy greens, with painstaking care. She planted them in neat rows, her fingers deep in the cool, dark earth. The garden became her therapy, a place where she could pour her silent grief and her tentative hopes into the soil. It was a small act of defiance against the harshness of the land and the emptiness within her. One afternoon, the sky began to change. The brilliant, cloudless blue bled into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The wind picked up, howling like a banshee, and the air grew thick with dust. A storm was coming. Callum rushed to secure the livestock in the barn, while Evelyn latched the shutters on the cabin windows. By the time he joined her inside, the world outside had disappeared into a churning, brown vortex. The dust storm raged for a full day. They were trapped inside the small cabin, the darkness of midday punctuated only by the dim light of a single lantern. The wind shrieked and battered against the log walls, and a fine silt seeped through every crack, coating their tongues and nostrils, making their eyes water. The relentless noise and the claustrophobic darkness wore on Evelyn's nerves. There was nowhere to hide from the storm, or from the man sitting across the table from her. In the suffocating dark, the barriers she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice a small, thin sound against the roar of the wind. He looked at her, his face shadowed and grim. "It'll pass. Not of the storm," she clarified, twisting her hands in her lap. The words came out in a painful rush, a confession she had never spoken aloud. "I'm not... Oh, the women in town, they were right. I'm damaged." The silence that followed was profound. The wind howled, filling the space her words had left empty. She expected him to agree, to look at her with pity or contempt. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the dim lantern light. "Neither am I," he said, his voice low and raw. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not an absolution or a denial. It was a shared truth, an admission of a parallel brokenness. For the first time, she felt truly seen. That night, as the storm began to subside, she sat huddled in a chair by the hearth, too shaken to sleep. He came and sat in the chair beside hers. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, a solid, grounding presence in the dark. The space between their chairs felt charged, but not with fear. It was a space of shared understanding, comforted by his proximity, his quiet companionship. She finally drifted off to sleep, her head slumping against her shoulder. A truce declared with the ghosts that haunted her. The next morning, the world was eerily still, blanketed in a thick layer of fine, red dust. The first thing Evelyn did was go to check on her garden. Her heart sank. The wind had flattened it. The tender green shoots were broken and buried under a layer of silt. It was a scene of total devastation. A sob caught in her throat. All that work, all that hope, erased in a single day. She stood there, staring at the ruin, feeling the sting of tears behind her eyes. Callum came and stood beside her. He looked at the destroyed garden, then at her face. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He knelt, and with his bare hands, began to gently brush the dust away from a buried squash plant. Evelyn watched him for a moment. Then she knelt beside him and did the same, silently, side by side. They worked to salvage what they could, their hands moving in a slow, synchronized rhythm. They spent the entire morning rebuilding the small plot, shoring up the rows, their shared, silent labor a more powerful comfort than any words could have been. A week later, a rider approached the homestead. It was not a welcome sight. Their isolation was a protective barrier, and visitors were a rarity and often a threat. The man was burly and unkempt, with a crude, leering smile and small, mean eyes. He introduced himself as Wade, a neighbor from a ranch a few miles to the south. "Just thought I'd come by and welcome the new missus," he said, his voice overly loud. His gaze raked over Evelyn, lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. It was a look she knew well, the look of a man who saw a woman as a piece of property, an object for his appraisal. She felt herself stiffen. her body instinctively retreating. Callum stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle but clear blocking maneuver. "We're busy. Wade," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Just being neighborly. Blackwood." Wade chuckled, ignoring the dismissal. He continued to stare at Evelyn. "You're a lucky man. A pretty little thing to warm your bed." The comment, so casual and demeaning, sent a jolt of pure ice through Evelyn's veins. It was the language of Abel, the crude assertion of ownership that had defined her former life. She saw Callum's hands clench into fists at his sides. "Get off my land," Callum said, his voice dangerously quiet. Wade's smile faltered. He looked from Callum's thunderous face to Evelyn's frightened one, then spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "No need to be like that," he grumbled, and turning his horse, he rode away. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. The visit had brought the ugliness of the outside world into their fragile sanctuary. After supper, Callum worked by the fire, not cleaning a rifle, but reinforcing the lock on the cabin door, adding a heavy wooden bar across it. When he was finished, he came to Evelyn. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a small, sharp knife with a carved wooden handle. She looked at it, then at him, confused. "Take it," he said. He closed her fingers around the handle. "Keep it with you." He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze dark and intense. "You don't need to be afraid of men like that anymore," he said. It was a vow, a solemn promise spoken into the quiet of the night. He was not just giving her a weapon. He was giving her back a piece of the power that had been stolen from her. The knife Callum had given her lived in the pocket of her apron. Its weight was a constant, solid presence against her thigh as she moved about the cabin. A secret reassurance. In the weeks that followed Wade's menacing visit, the memory of his leering eyes and Callum's cold fury settled into the foundation of their shared existence. The reinforced door was a physical boundary against the outside world. But it was the unspoken understanding that passed between them that truly began to change the atmosphere within the cabin's log walls. They had seen a glimpse of the other's darkness, and instead of recoiling, had stood their ground together. The silence, once a vast, empty expanse between them, began to fill with something else. It started one evening as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The day's work was done, and a quiet stillness had settled over the homestead. Evelyn held the knife in her lap, her fingers tracing the smooth, carved wood of the handle. "He gave me this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Callum looked up from the harness he was mending, his hands still. He knew she wasn't talking about him. "My first husband, Abel." The name felt like a foreign object in her mouth, a word she had not spoken in a very long time. "He told me it was for peeling potatoes, but he liked to watch me use it. He said it was important for a woman to know her way around a blade." She paused, the memory surfacing, sharp and ugly. "He wanted me to be afraid of it, of him." Callum said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression patient, giving her the space to continue. His quiet attention was a stark contrast to Abel's demanding, impatient presence. It was this stillness that gave her the courage to go on, to pull the splinters of her past out into the light, one by one. "We were to have a child," she said, her eyes fixed on the fire. "A son. I was so happy. I thought maybe a baby would soften him, make him kind." A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "I was a fool." She told him about the fall, the pain, the blood. She spoke of the emptiness that came after, a hollow ache that was far worse than any physical pain. She told him of Abel's scorn, of the word he had used to brand her, useless. She confessed the shame that had become her constant companion, the feeling that she was a broken thing, a failure at the one task a woman was meant to fulfill. She spoke until the words ran out, leaving her feeling raw and exposed in the firelight. Through it all, Callum sat and listened. He did not flinch from the ugliness of her story. He did not offer hollow words of comfort. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her as if she were a person who had endured a great and terrible storm, and he was simply bearing witness to the fact that she had survived. When she fell silent, her hands trembling, he still said nothing. He simply absorbed her pain, his presence a steady, solid anchor in the turbulent sea of her memory. After a long while, he set aside the harness he was mending. "My brother, Daniel," he began, his voice a low rumble. He was 4 years younger than me, all fire and laughter. He thought I knew everything, that I could fix anything. Callum's gaze drifted to a place far beyond the cabin walls, to a memory that was as raw as Evelyn's. We were on a cattle drive, heading for the railhead in Kansas. I was 19. He was 15. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he'd begged me, and I'd convinced Pa to let him come. He was my charge. I was supposed to be watching him. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working. A storm blew in, one of those prairie storms that turns the sky black in the middle of the day. The cattle spooked. It was chaos. Thunder so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. We were trying to push the herd across a shallow creek when the sky just opened up. A flash flood. It came down the dry creek bed like a brown wall of water. He fell silent, and in the quiet, Evelyn could hear the roar of the water, the terror of the stampeding cattle. I lost sight of him. 1 minute he was there, on his horse, his face pale in the lightning, and the next, he was gone. We found him 2 days later, miles downstream. Callum's voice cracked on the last word. Pa never said a word, but he never looked at me the same way again. He didn't have to. I knew it was my fault. I was the older brother. He was my responsibility. He looked down at his own hands, large and calloused, as if seeing for the first time that they had failed to hold on to the one thing that mattered most. The silence that filled the room now was different. It was not hers alone, nor his alone. It was theirs, a shared space of grief and guilt. Slowly, tentatively, Evelyn reached out and laid her small, work-roughened hand over his. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible tremor, then grew still, allowing her to offer the simple, profound comfort he had just offered her. They sat like that for a long time, two solitary people bound by their shared brokenness, the fire slowly dying down to embers. After that night, the invisible wall between them dissolved. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, quiet erosion. The changes were subtle, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. She began to touch him without thinking, a light hand on his arm to get his attention when supper was ready. She learned he favored the rich beef stew she made, and she took to baking a small pan of biscuits to go with it, just because she saw the quiet pleasure in his eyes when she did. One afternoon, he returned from a trip to the far pastures and handed her a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. She unwrapped it to find a comb, carved from a piece of pale, smooth willow wood. It was simple, but the teeth were perfectly spaced, the handle worn smooth and warm to the touch. It was a thing of beauty and utility, made by his hands, for her. She ran it through her long hair that night, the wood feeling kinder than the harsh metal of her old comb. It was a gift of time and care, a silent acknowledgement of her as a woman, not just a housekeeper. A tentative warmth began to grow in the small cabin, a fragile bloom in the harsh landscape. One afternoon, while feeding the chickens, one of the hens made a clumsy, flapping leap for a kernel of corn and landed upside down in the water trough, its legs flailing in the air. The sight was so absurd, so undignified, that a sound bubbled up from Evelyn's chest that she did not recognize. It was laughter, a real, unrestrained laugh. Callum, who was walking from the barn, stopped and stared. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his stern eyes. The sound of her laughter and the sight of his smile felt more miraculous than the spring rains they so desperately needed. Their bond deepened in these quiet moments, in the shared glance across the dinner table, in the way he would hand her a cup of coffee in the morning, already knowing she liked it with a little sugar, in the way she would leave a lantern burning in the window if he was out late. a small beacon in the vast, dark expanse. They were learning the language of each other's silence. One evening in late summer, they spent the entire day together repairing a long stretch of fence on the southern edge of the property. They worked side by side under the hot sun, their movements falling into an easy, efficient rhythm. They spoke little, but the companionship was easy, comfortable. When they returned to the cabin, exhausted and covered in dust, the air between them felt different, charged with a new awareness. After they had eaten, he sat in his chair by the fire, and she sat in hers. But the space between the chairs felt like a chasm. The memory of his quiet strength, of his gentle respect, of his rare, heart-stopping smile, had taken root inside her. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a stranger or a warden, but as a man, a good, quiet, wounded man. A yearning she had thought long dead stirred within her, a desire not just for physical closeness, but for a deeper, more profound connection. She rose from her chair and went to stand before him. He looked up, his expression questioning. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "Do you want me, for real?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper. The question was about more than just a single night. It was about all the nights to come. It was her asking if the bargain could ever be more than a bargain. Callum's stormy eyes searched her face. He saw the fear there, the uncertainty, but he also saw the flicker of hope. He could have taken what she was offering. He was a lonely man, and the desire for a woman's comfort was a constant, low ache inside him. But he looked at her, at this fragile, resilient woman who had begun to trust him, and he knew he could not. He reached out, not to pull her to him, but to gently take her hand. "Not until you want it, too, Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. With no fear, with no ghosts in the room. His words were a gift, a release from an obligation she had been prepared to fulfill. He was giving her a choice, a power she had never had before. Overwhelmed by a rush of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a startling wave of affection, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief, light kiss, as soft and tentative as a butterfly's wing. It was the first kiss of her life that was not taken, but freely given. The instant her lips left his, a blind panic seized her. It was too much, too soon. The ghost of Abel rose up, his cruel laughter echoing in her mind. What was she doing? She straightened up abruptly and retreated to her room, closing the door behind her without a word, her breath coming in ragged gasps, leaving Callum alone in the firelight, the ghost of her kiss still warm on his lips. He did not follow her. He did not call her name. He respected her silence. The next morning, she could not meet his eyes. A thick, awkward tension filled the cabin. She moved about her chores stiffly, her movements jerky and uncertain. She had offered something, then snatched it away, and the shame of her own confusion was a bitter taste in her mouth. He seemed to understand. He gave her space, his presence as unobtrusive as possible, and left for the day's work earlier than usual. She spent the day in a state of turmoil. She had panicked, had run from the one man who had ever shown her true gentleness. By the time evening fell, she was exhausted from her own inner conflict. When he returned, he was quiet, his face weary. After their silent supper, he slumped into his chair by the fire, a bone-deep weariness in his posture. She watched him for a long time. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a stronger feeling was taking hold, the fear of losing this fragile peace, this quiet companionship. Slowly, she went to him. She did not stand before him, but sat on the floor by his chair, as she had seen a loyal dog do. After a moment of hesitation, she leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder. He tensed for a moment, surprised, then relaxed. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply allowed her to be there, to find her own comfort in his presence. She closed her eyes, the scent of dust, leather, and him filling her senses. The warmth from his body seeped into hers, a steady, reassuring heat. Here, in this quiet moment, there was no fear. there was only a profound and peaceful sense of rightness. Their bond, now forged in confession and tested by a failed advance, settled into something deeper and more resilient. But the outside world was not content to leave them to their quiet peace. A few days later, Callum rode out to check on a waterhole on the far side of the property. A full day's ride. "I'll be back after dark," he told her, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. "Bar the door behind me." She spent the day feeling strangely unsettled, his absence leaving the cabin feeling too large, too empty. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the land, she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Her heart leapt, thinking Callum had returned early. She peered through the window, and her blood ran cold. It was not Callum, it was Wade. He dismounted and strode to the cabin door with an arrogant swagger. He pounded on the door. "I know you're in there, little bird," he called out, his voice thick and slurred. "Blackwood's gone for the day. Saw him ride out myself. Let's you and I get a little more neighborly." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She backed away from the door, her hand instinctively going to the apron pocket where she kept the knife. The heavy bar was in place across the door, but it suddenly felt like a flimsy piece of wood. "Go away, Wade," she called out, her voice trembling but louder than she expected. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Don't be like that. I just want to talk." He rattled the doorknob. When it didn't give, he put his shoulder to the door. The wood groaned under the impact. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. But then she remembered Callum's words. "You don't need to be afraid of men like that anymore." She took the knife from her pocket, her hands slick with sweat. The blade clicked open with a sound that seemed deafening in the terrified silence. He hit the door again, harder this time. A crack appeared in the frame. He was going to break it down. "Get away from my house!" she screamed, the words tearing from her throat, a raw cry of fury and fear. "Or what?" he taunted from the other side. "You gonna cry me away?" He drew back for another charge, just as his weight hit the door. She lunged forward and shoved the tip of the knife into the crack in the wood, right at the level where his face would be. "The next thing that comes through this door gets this in it," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper she didn't recognize as her own. There was a sudden, shocked silence on the other side. Then, a string of vile curses. "You crazy witch!" he snarled. "You'll regret this." She heard him stumble back, still cursing. A moment later, she heard the sound of his horse galloping away into the deepening twilight. She stood with her back pressed against the splintered door, the knife still clutched in her hand, her body shaking uncontrollably. She didn't move until she heard the familiar, welcome sound of Callum's horse an hour later. She fumbled with the bar and threw the door open, nearly falling into his arms. He took one look at her white, terrified face, at the knife in her hand, at the damaged door, and his own face became a mask of cold, murderous rage. He didn't ask what happened. He knew. He led her inside and sat her in the chair. He wrapped his heavy canvas coat around her shaking shoulders, enveloping her in his warmth. He knelt before her, taking the knife from her nerveless fingers. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, and then the tears came, hot and unstoppable. She sobbed, not quietly this time, but with great, gasping cries, all the terror of the past hour, and of all the years before it, pouring out of her. Callum pulled her from the chair and into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as she wept. He stroked her hair, murmuring quiet, soothing words, his lips against her temple. He held her until the last of the sobs had subsided, leaving her limp and exhausted in his embrace. She looked up at him, her face tear-stained and pale in the lantern light. The ugly reality of her life, of the trouble that seemed to follow her, felt like a heavy stone in her stomach. He had offered her a safe harbor, and she had brought a storm to his shores. "Will you stay?" she whispered, the question ragged and full of a desperate, trembling hope. "After this?" The dawn following Wade's attack broke cold and clear, the air scrubbed clean by the night's terror. Evelyn's question. Will you stay after this?" Still hung in the quiet space between them, a fragile plea that demanded more than just a simple yes. Callum's answer came not in words, but in action. He hitched the buckboard before the sun had fully crested the hills, his movements tight with a cold, controlled fury. He was going to Laramie. He was going to see the sheriff. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Sheriff Miller was a man whose ambition had long ago been eroded by the vast, lawless territory he was meant to tame. He leaned back in his chair, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and listened to Callum's clipped, factual account of Wade's visit, of the threats and the attempt to break down his door. When Callum finished, the sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "Well, Callum, that's a tough one," he said, picking at his teeth with a sliver of wood. "It's your word against his. You got any witnesses?" "My wife was there," Callum said, his voice dangerously low. "She's the one he terrorized." "Ah, yes. Your wife," the sheriff said, and the way he said the word made it sound like an accusation. "The mail-order bride? A widow from back east." He let the implications hang in the air. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, a woman with a past and no local family was an unreliable narrator by default. "Wade will say he was just being neighborly, maybe had a bit too much to drink. He'll say your woman is high-strung, that she overreacted. A woman's word, especially a newcomer. It's a hard thing to build a case on. Son, there's not much I can do unless he actually harms one of you." Callum's hands clenched into fists on the sheriff's desk. "So I'm supposed to wait until he puts his hands on her, or burns my house down?" "Now, calm down," the sheriff said, holding up a placating hand. "I'll ride out and have a word with Wade, warn him to keep his distance. But that's all I can do." Officially, Callum left the office with a rage so profound it felt like a sickness in his gut. Justice, he realized, was a flimsy concept out here. It was a luxury for those who lived in town, who had neighbors and witnesses and reputations. For a solitary man and his mail-order bride, there was only what they could protect for themselves. The law would not save them. When he returned to the ranch and told Evelyn what the sheriff had said, she was not surprised. Disappointment was a familiar taste, but something else was present in her now. Alongside the fear, a cold, hard anger. She had been a victim her whole life, a victim of Abel's cruelty, of a society that whispered behind her back, of men like Wade who saw her as prey. That evening, as Callum cleaned his rifle by the fire, she watched him, her eyes tracing the lethal lines of the Winchester. She watched the way he handled it, with a practiced, respectful familiarity. She watched him load the cartridges, his movements economical and precise. The next afternoon, while he was out mending the fence line, she took the rifle down from its pegs on the wall. The weapon was heavier than she'd imagined, cold and unforgiving in her hands. It felt alien, powerful, terrifying. She carried it out behind the barn, her heart pounding. She had seen him do it 100 times. She raised the heavy barrel, rested the stock against her shoulder as he did, and tried to sight down the length of it at an old fence post. Her arms trembled from the weight. She loaded a single cartridge into the chamber, her fingers clumsy and stiff. She closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that seemed to split the air. The rifle kicked back with a brutal force, slamming into her shoulder and knocking her off balance. She cried out, more from shock than pain, and dropped the gun in the dust. Her shot had gone wide, splintering the dirt a good 10 feet from the post. Her shoulder throbbed, and the smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils, acrid and sharp. She stood there, trembling, a profound sense of failure washing over her. "What in God's name are you doing, Evelyn?" Callum's voice, harsh with alarm, cut through the ringing in her ears. He was striding towards her from the corral, his face a thunderous mask of anger and concern. He had come back for a coil of wire. "You could have killed yourself," he said, his voice tight as he picked up the rifle.
This is not a toy.
"I know it's not a toy," she retorted, rubbing her bruised shoulder, her own fear turning to defiance. "I want you to teach me, properly." He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "No, absolutely not. This is my job. I'll protect you." "You can't be here every minute of every day." "Callum," she said, her voice rising with a passion that surprised them both. "What if Wade had gotten through that door? What would I have done? Waited for him to hurt me? Waited for you to come home and find—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The image was too horrific. She looked him square in the eye. All her pain, all her history in her gaze. "My first husband. He taught me what it is to be helpless. I will never be helpless again. Not ever." Her words, raw and unyielding, struck him silent. He saw the fierce, desperate determination in her eyes, and he understood. It wasn't about him or his ability to protect her. It was about her. It was about her reclaiming a part of herself that had been stolen. He looked at her standing there, small and bruised but unbroken, and the last of his resistance crumbled. He sighed, a long, heavy breath. "All right, Evelyn," he said, his voice softer now. "All right." Their lessons began the next day. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to hold the rifle so it wouldn't punish her. He showed her how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger gently, not jerk it. He was a patient, exacting teacher. He made her practice with the rifle unloaded for a full day until the movements were second nature. When she finally fired it again, she was ready for the kick. The shot was still wide, but not by as much. Day after day, she practiced. Her shoulder was a constant, dull ache. But with each shot, her arms grew steadier. The fence post she used as a target became pockmarked with her efforts. She was not a natural shot, but she was determined. And slowly, she improved. The rifle began to feel less like a weapon and more like a tool, an extension of her own will. Their shared purpose during these lessons forged a new kind of intimacy between them. He would stand behind her, his hands gently adjusting her stance, his breath warm against her ear as he gave quiet instructions. The physical closeness was practical, instructional, but it sparked a low, simmering heat between them. She began to see the lines of his back, the strength in his arms, the quiet intensity of his focus. In a new light, he, in turn, saw the iron core of her, the resilience that her fragile exterior belied. One evening, after a long day of work, followed by a frustrating session of target practice, a quiet exhaustion settled over them. They ate their supper in a comfortable silence, the unspoken connection between them a tangible presence in the room. Later, as they sat by the fire, she looked at him, at the man who had seen her at her most broken and had not turned away, the man who was now arming her, not just with a weapon, but with a strength she had never known she possessed, the last of her fear, the last of Abel's ghosts, seemed to finally dissolve into the flickering shadows. She rose from her chair and went to him. She didn't speak. She simply took his hand and led him from his chair. He followed, his eyes searching hers, a silent question in their depths. She led him to her room, to the small, monastic space that had been her sanctuary. In the dim moonlight filtering through the single window, she turned to him. She raised her hands to his face, her fingers tracing the rough, sun-weathered lines of his cheeks. Then, with a certainty that came from the deepest part of her soul, she drew his head down and kissed him. This kiss was nothing like the brief, panicked one she had given him before. It was slow and deep, a silent communication of all the words they had never said. It spoke of gratitude, of shared sorrow, of a hesitant, burgeoning hope. He responded with a gentleness that she was beginning to realize was his true nature. His large, calloused hands, hands that could break a horse or mend a fence, were impossibly tender as they cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her skin. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers.
Evelyn,
He breathed, his voice thick with emotion.
are you sure? I'm sure,
she whispered, her voice unwavering. There was no fear. There was no shame. There was only him. Their lovemaking was a slow, tender exploration, a quiet conversation between two people who had been starved of kindness for too long. For Evelyn, it was a revelation. It was not a violation, not a duty, but a shared, sacred act. It was a reclaiming of her own body, a healing of old wounds. In his arms, she was not damaged goods. She was cherished. She was whole. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the moonlight painting silver stripes across the quilt. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. This wasn't part of the bargain, she said softly into the quiet darkness. He stroked her hair.
No, it wasn't. I don't want a bargain anymore. Callum, she said, her voice clear and strong. I want a real marriage.
He was silent for a long moment, and a flicker of fear returned. Had she presumed too much? But then he shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. In the moonlight, she could see the raw emotion in his eyes. "Will you marry me again, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice rough with sincerity. "Properly?" Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." She agreed without hesitation, but later, alone with her thoughts, a small, cold seed of doubt remained. Could this happiness, so new and fragile, possibly last? It felt like tempting fate to want so much. They rode into Laramie a week later to file the marriage papers at the courthouse. As they walked down the dusty main street, Evelyn felt the familiar stares, the curious glances. But this time, she did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She walked with her head held high, her hand tucked securely in the crook of Callum's arm. Some of the townswomen, the ones with kind eyes, offered her small, shy smiles of congratulations. Others, like the women from the general store, still watched her with suspicion, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves behind her back. She ignored them. Their opinions no longer had the power to wound her. She was not Callum's hired bride anymore. She was the woman he loved. They returned to the ranch that evening, their hearts full. The simple piece of paper from the courthouse felt like a shield, a declaration to the world. But the world was not finished with them yet. They were woken late that night by a frantic whinnying from the horses. Callum was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing his rifle. Evelyn followed him to the door and her heart stopped. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls, casting a terrifying, demonic orange glow against the black sky. "Stay in the house and bar the door," Callum yelled over the roar of the fire as he ran towards the inferno. Evelyn watched in horror from the cabin window, her knuckles white as she gripped the rifle. She saw him wrestle with the heavy barn door, finally wrenching it open just as a section of the roof began to collapse. He disappeared into the choking black smoke. For a terrifying minute, there was nothing. Then he emerged, leading their two frightened horses, their eyes wide with terror. He got them safely into the corral, then stood, silhouetted against the flames, watching the structure that housed his livelihood. His tools and their winter hay supply burned to the ground. There was nothing he could do. By dawn, the barn was a smoking, blackened ruin. They stood together, looking at the devastation, the acrid smell of smoke thick in the air. There was no doubt in either of their minds who had done it. Wade. There was no proof, of course, just the certainty that his brand of cowardly evil would not let him rest. Evelyn looked from the smoldering ruins of their future to the grim, exhausted face of the man beside her. This had all happened because of her. She was the trouble that had been brought to his door. "If it's him or me," she asked, her voice quiet but intense,
If it comes down to a choice between this ranch, your life, and me, who do you choose?" Callum turned to look at her. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. His eyes were clear, his gaze unwavering. "There's no question, Evelyn," he said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "You." His answer was a balm to her soul, but it also terrified her. She was worth more to him than anything, and that knowledge was a heavy, precious burden. That night, her sleep was troubled. She dreamed of her lost son again. But this time, the dream was different. He was not fading away. He was sitting under a large, solitary cottonwood tree that grew near the creek, playing in the grass. He looked up at her and smiled, a peaceful, happy smile. She woke with a sense of calm she had not felt in years. The next morning, she went to the cottonwood tree. She gathered a small handful of hardy purple wildflowers that grew along the creek bed and placed them at the base of the tree's trunk. She did not know his name, had never had the chance to give him one. In her heart, she called him Daniel, a quiet tribute to the brother Callum had lost. She was not burying her grief, but giving it a home. A few days later, she saw Callum out by the woodpile, not chopping firewood, but carefully selecting a piece of smooth, pale pine. He took it into the small shed where he kept his tools. Over the next week, in the quiet hours of the evening, she would hear the soft, rhythmic sounds of sawing and sanding coming from the shed. He never mentioned what he was doing, and she never asked. But one afternoon, she peeked through a crack in the shed door. In the dusty shafts of light, she could see the unmistakable shape of a baby's cradle, its rockers perfectly curved. He was building a space for a future she had not yet dared to speak aloud. And as the days shortened into autumn, a quiet suspicion began to grow within her, a subtle change in her body, a new and unfamiliar weariness in the mornings. She had been so consumed with the fire and its aftermath that she had not paid close attention. But now, the signs were undeniable. She thought back to the night they had first come together, with a sense of dawning wonder and a deep, trembling fear. She realized she might be pregnant. She didn't tell Callum. The hope was too fragile, too new. She held the secret close to her heart, a tiny, flickering candle flame in the dark. The news of Circuit Judge Thompson's impending arrival in Laramie spread through the territory like a prairie fire. For weeks, it was the only topic of conversation. A circuit judge was a rare and momentous event, a brief visit from a world of formal law and consequence, a chance for grievances to be aired and justice, however rough, to be dispensed. For most, it was a matter of civic curiosity. For Callum and Evelyn, it was a reckoning. The day he heard the news, Callum found Evelyn by the ruins of the barn, sorting through salvaged tools, her face smudged with soot. The blackened timbers stood like a skeletal monument to Wade's malice, a constant, ugly reminder of their vulnerability. "The circuit judge is coming," he said, his voice flat. "He'll be in Laramie for a week, hearing cases." Evelyn's hand stilled. She looked up at him, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She knew what he was going to say before he said it. "You should report him, Evelyn," he said quietly. "Not just to the sheriff, to the judge. Tell him everything, the threats, the fire, the door." A cold wave of fear washed over her. The thought of standing up in a room full of strangers, of having their eyes on her, of speaking her shame aloud, was nauseating. "They won't believe me," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the charred ground. "I'm a woman, a stranger. They'll twist my words. They will talk about my past, about how I came here." "I'll be right there with you," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "We will tell the truth. It's all we have, but it's enough." He knelt in front of her, forcing her to meet his gaze. What Wade did was a crime. He can't be allowed to get away with it, not just for us, for whoever he might decide to terrorize next. He paused, his stormy eyes softening. Your voice deserves to be heard. His faith in her, in the power of her truth, was a thing of awesome and terrifying force. It was a greater burden than any rifle. She thought of the cold dread she felt every time she saw a rider in the distance, the way her hand flew to the knife in her pocket. She thought of the child growing secretly within her, and the world she wanted to bring it into, a world where monsters were not allowed to roam free. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time, her anger was stronger. She nodded. "I'll do it." The day of the trial. The town of Laramie was buzzing. The makeshift courtroom had been set up in the largest room of the saloon. The chairs and tables cleared away to make space for benches and a raised platform for the judge. The room smelled of sawdust, stale beer, and the nervous sweat of a crowd hungry for drama. Evelyn sat beside Callum on a hard wooden bench near the front, her hands clenched tightly in the lap of her plainest gray dress. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her back, could hear the low murmur of whispers. She kept her gaze fixed on her hands, her stomach churning with a mixture of morning sickness and pure terror. When her name was called, Callum squeezed her hand, a silent message of support. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they were made of cotton, her every step an act of sheer will. Judge Thompson was an imposing man with a stern, weary face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She recounted the events, her voice at first a trembling whisper, but growing stronger and clearer as she spoke. She told them about Wade's first visit, his crude words, the leering way he had looked at her. She told them about the night he returned when Callum was away, about the terrifying sound of his body hitting the door, the splintering wood, the hissed threats. She held up the small knife. "This is what I used to make him leave," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "He said I would regret it." She looked directly at Wade, who sat beside his lawyer, his face a mask of smug denial. A week later, our barn burned down. The testimony was powerful in its simplicity. There was no hysteria, no embellishment, just the plain, unvarnished truth. A hush fell over the courtroom. But then Wade's lawyer, a slick, reptilian man named Fletcher, rose to his feet. He approached her with a patronizing smile. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It must have been very difficult for you, losing your first husband back in Ohio." Evelyn stiffened. "That has nothing to do with this." "Doesn't it?" Fletcher pressed on, turning to the jury of 12 grim-faced ranchers and merchants. "Here we have a woman, recently bereaved, who travels 1,000 miles to a strange land to marry a man she's never met. A woman who, by her own admission, is not accustomed to the rugged realities of frontier life. Would you say you are of a nervous disposition, Mrs. Blackwood?" "I would say I am a woman who knows a threat when she hears one," she replied, her chin held high. "A threat or a clumsy, perhaps drunken attempt at neighborly conversation from a lonely rancher?" He sneered. "You see, the defense contends that my client, Mr. Wade, was merely paying a social call, and that you, in your fragile emotional state, misinterpreted his intentions, that you are, to put it plainly, an unreliable witness." He paced in front of her, his voice growing louder, more accusatory. "Isn't it true that you were an outcast in your own town, that you fled after your husband's death under a cloud of shame? Isn't it true that you came here because you had nowhere else to go? You are a broken woman, Mrs. Blackwood, a woman haunted by tragedy. It is a sad story, to be sure, but it does not make your fanciful accusations true." Each word was a poisoned dart, striking at her deepest insecurities. He was painting a picture of her as a hysterical, damaged creature, incapable of discerning reality from fantasy. She could feel the mood in the room shifting, the whispers starting up again. She looked at Callum. He was leaning forward, every muscle in his body coiled with a murderous rage. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and for a moment,
She thought he would launch himself over the railing and throttle the man. His knuckles were white where he gripped the bench.
"That's enough! Fletcher!"
the judge warned, his voice sharp. But the damage was done. The lawyer had planted the seeds of doubt. The room began to spin. The faces in the crowd blurred, their whispers turning into a low, menacing buzz. The air grew thick and heavy, and she couldn't draw a proper breath. A black and white haze crept in at the edges of her vision. Fletcher's smirking face seemed to float in front of her, his voice a distant, mocking echo. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but no sound would come out. The floor seemed to tilt violently beneath her feet. With a small, helpless cry, Evelyn fainted, her body slumping forward off the witness chair. The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp. Before she could hit the floor, Callum was there. He vaulted over the railing in a single, fluid motion and caught her, sweeping her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He held her against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. A dead silence fell over the room. The sight of the stoic, formidable Callum Blackwood cradling his fragile wife with such fierce tenderness was more powerful than any testimony. Every person in that room saw not a broken woman, but a cherished one. They saw not a hired bride, but a husband's love, raw and absolute. "This court will take a recess," Judge Thompson declared, his voice booming in the stillness. Callum carried her to a small antechamber, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He laid her gently on a cot and chafed her wrists, his face a mask of anguish and fear. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice ragged. "Evelyn, come back to me." Her eyelids fluttered open. She saw his face, etched with worry, and the shame washed over her again. She had failed. She had let Fletcher break her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks. "Don't you dare be sorry," he said fiercely. "You were the bravest person in that room." When the judge reconvened the court, he allowed Evelyn to remain resting in the back room. "Does the witness have a written statement?" he asked. "She does," Callum said, his voice hard as iron. He strode to the witness stand, holding the pages Evelyn had painstakingly written out the night before. He stood where she had stood, but there was no fear in him, only a cold, righteous anger. "I will read the statement of my wife, Evelyn Blackwood," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the jury, daring any of them to question it. He began to read, and a strange, powerful thing happened. The words were hers, the elegant, precise sentences, the descriptions of her fear, the quiet dignity of her prose. It was all her, but the voice was his. It was her truth, spoken with his strength. He read of her terror when the door splintered, her shame under the lawyer's attacks, her unwavering certainty of Wade's guilt in the fire. He gave her voice a shield of steel. The courtroom listened, rapt, not just to the story of a crime, but to the story of a husband's unwavering devotion. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. The jury filed out and returned in less than 10 minutes. The verdict was guilty. Guilty of assault. Guilty of attempted arson. Wade was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. As they led him away in shackles, his brother, a mean-looking man with the same cruel eyes, caught Callum's gaze and drew a finger across his own throat. The family would not forget. The victory felt hollow. That night, as a cold autumn rain began to fall, drumming against the roof of the cabin, Evelyn's body betrayed her. It started as a small cramp, a familiar, dreaded ache in her lower back. She went to the privy, and when she saw the spot of bright red blood, a cry of pure animal terror escaped her lips. It was happening again. Lightning quick, she was back in that cold room in Ohio, the life draining out of her, Abel's voice spitting venom in her ear. She stumbled back into the cabin, her face ashen, her hand pressed against her stomach. "Callum!" she gasped, the word barely a whisper.
The baby. He took one look at her face, at the blood on the hem of her nightdress, and his own face went pale. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and saddlebags, shoved a tin of coffee and some hardtack into them, and ran for the corral. "I'm getting the midwife from the Miller place," he yelled over the rising wind and rain. "Bar the door. Don't move from your bed." She watched him ride out into the black, stormy night, a lone figure swallowed by the deluge. The Miller place was 15 miles away, a treacherous ride on a good day. In this storm, it was madness. She crawled into bed, curling into a tight ball, her hands protectively clutching her belly, and prayed. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, prayed for Callum's safety, prayed for the tiny, fragile life inside her. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Finally, just before dawn, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Callum returned, soaked to the bone and mud-splattered, with a stout, gray-haired woman riding behind him. Her name was Sarah Miller, and her face was a calm, reassuring island in Evelyn's sea of panic. Sarah examined her gently, her hands practiced and kind. She asked quiet questions, her voice a soothing balm. After a long, tense silence, she looked at Evelyn and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're not losing this baby, child," she said softly. "The bleeding is from exhaustion and stress. Your body has been through a terrible ordeal, but the baby's heart is strong." She turned to Callum, who was standing stiffly in the corner, his face a wreck of fear. "She needs to rest, complete rest, for at least 2 weeks. Nothing more strenuous than lifting a teacup." The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, that it broke something open inside Evelyn. The terror of the past 12 hours, coupled with the trauma of the trial and the ever-present ghost of her first loss, came pouring out in a flood of ragged sobs. She cried for the child she had almost lost, for the husband who had ridden through a storm for her, for the sheer, terrifying fragility of happiness. Callum came and sat on the edge of the bed, gathering her into his arms. She clung to him, weeping into his chest. "I was so scared," she sobbed. I can't do it again. Callum, it hurts too much to lose something you love." It was the truest thing she had ever said, the core of all her fear. To love was to open yourself up to unbearable loss. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just held her, absorbing her grief, his presence a solid, unwavering truth. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. The memory of her desperate question on the night of Wade's attack surfaced, but now it was answered, proven beyond any doubt. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "After everything, you stayed." He bent his head and kissed her forehead, a kiss that was a solemn vow. "Of course I did," he replied. In the weeks that followed, the town that had once whispered about her began to show a different side. Her courage at the trial had earned her a new, grudging respect. One afternoon, one of the women who had been kind to her at the courthouse left a jar of wild plum jam on their porch. Another day, a rancher from a neighboring spread left a small stack of books. When Callum went to town for supplies, men who had once ignored him now nodded in respect. They were small gestures, but they were not insignificant. They were seeds of acceptance, small kindnesses that began to stitch the solitary homestead back into the fabric of the community. Evelyn, confined to her bed, watched these small miracles unfold and felt the first tentative stirrings of belonging. She was no longer just Callum's wife. She was one of them. She was home. The harsh Wyoming winter finally relinquished its grip, giving way to a spring so vibrant and full of life, it felt like a personal apology from the land itself. The wind, for once, was gentle, carrying the sweet scent of new grass and damp earth. The hills, once a uniform brown, were now stippled with the tender green of returning life. And on the Blackwood homestead, the changes were even more profound. Months passed in a rhythm of quiet, purposeful work. Evelyn, now visibly pregnant, moved with a new, deliberate grace. Her belly swelled, a gentle, assertive curve that proclaimed the life growing within her. The cabin, once a stark and lonely shelter, had transformed into a home. There were curtains on the windows, sewn from a bolt of cheerful calico she had bought in town. A braided rag rug lay before the hearth, its bright colors a defiant splash against the rough-hewn floor. The garden, her small patch of defiant hope, was flourishing under her devoted care. Beans climbed their poles with vigor, and the squash plants unfurled huge, confident leaves. Flowers bloomed again, not just the wild ones by the creek, but cultivated ones she had coaxed from seeds offered by Sarah Miller, the midwife. Their colors were a daily testament to renewal. The cradle was nearly done. In the evenings, after the chores were finished, Callum would work on it by the light of the fire. He was not a man of flowery words, but his love was there in the patient, methodical glide of the sandpaper over the pale pine, in the careful joining of the rockers, in the way he would run his calloused hand over the smooth, finished wood, as if he could already feel the small head that would one day rest there. He was building not just a piece of furniture, but a promise, a future. Evelyn, watching him, felt a sense of peace that was so new, so complete. It was almost frightening. This peace gave her a strength she had never known. One afternoon, sitting at the small table with a pen and a precious sheet of paper, she began to write. She wrote not to family, she had none to speak of, but to a woman she had known in Ohio, another widow who had been treated with a similar mixture of pity and contempt by the town. "I am writing to you," she wrote, her pen scratching softly in the quiet cabin. "Not out of sadness, but out of a kind of hope I did not know existed. I have learned here, in this vast and empty place, that we are not defined by the sorrows that befall us. We are not broken things. Our worth is not measured by the husbands we have lost, or the children we could not carry. You are not damaged. You are a survivor, and your life is your own to reclaim. Do not let their whispers become the truth you tell yourself. Your voice is your own. I pray you find the courage to use it." She sent the letter without knowing if it would ever be answered, but the act of writing it, of reaching out from her own fragile happiness to touch another's pain, was a healing in itself. Weeks later, a letter arrived for her from the East. It was a reply. The woman had read her words, and they had given her the courage to leave a situation where she was being taken advantage of by her late husband's family. Evelyn read the letter with tears streaming down her face, and for the first time, they were not tears of grief, but of a fierce, profound connection. She wrote other letters, and some wrote back. A small, invisible network of women finding strength in shared truth. One clear, warm day in early summer, as the cottonwood tree by the creek rustled its new leaves in the gentle breeze, Callum and Evelyn decided to have their wedding. There would be no preacher, no church. Their vows would be witnessed by the land that had forged them and the few kind friends who had shown them grace. Sarah Miller came, her kind face beaming, and brought with her a small, lopsided cake. A neighboring rancher and his wife, a quiet couple who had left a sack of seed potatoes on their porch after the fire, came as well, their presence a silent offering of community. They stood under the cottonwood, the same tree where Evelyn had placed flowers for the son she had lost. The spot was no longer a place of sorrow, but a place of remembrance and peace. Callum wore a clean shirt and held her hand in his large palm engulfing hers, a familiar, comforting weight. Evelyn wore a simple blue dress and had woven some wildflowers into her hair. He spoke his vows first, his voice low and rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Evelyn," he said, his eyes locked on hers, "I have never been a man of many words. This land, it takes more than it gives. It leaves a man hard. I thought all the soft parts of me were buried long ago. Then you came,
You were quiet and scared, but you had a strength in you I had never seen. You showed me that a house is not a home without a heart in it. You are the heart in it. My heart. I promise to stand between you and any storm. I promise to be a man you can lean on. I promise my whole life to you, for as long as I have breath. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she spoke her own vows, her voice thick but clear. Callum, I came here with nothing but the ghosts of my past. I thought I was empty. I thought I was broken. You gave me a room of my own, but you also gave me a place to heal. You listened to my silence. You defended my name. You taught me how to be strong. You have shown me what it is to be cherished, not owned, to be loved, not used. I give you what is left of my heart, and I promise to spend the rest of my days helping you to make it whole again. I am your wife. In truth, forever. They exchanged no rings. Their clasped hands, calloused and scarred, were a more honest symbol of their bond. They were a testament to the hard work, the shared burdens, the life they were building together. But the world outside their small circle of peace had a long memory. A week after their wedding, as Evelyn was tending her garden in the late afternoon sun, a rider approached. It was Wade's brother, Caleb, his face a twisted mask of resentment. He reined his horse in just outside the garden fence. "Enjoying your little paradise, Mrs. Blackwood?" he sneered, his eyes full of the same mean-spirited venom as his brother's. "My brother is rotting in a cell because of your lies. This ain't over. You and your man, you'll get what's coming to you. A fire was just the start." The Evelyn of a year ago would have frozen. She would have run, but this Evelyn, her hand resting instinctively on the swell of her belly, did not move. A cold, clear anger rose up in her, eclipsing the fear. "You are not welcome on this land," she said, her voice steady and low. "Leave now." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'll leave when I'm good and ready. Maybe I'll just wait here for your husband to get back. We have some things to settle." He made a move to dismount. In that instant, Evelyn acted. She did not think. She simply moved. She turned and walked, not ran, back to the cabin. She took the Winchester down from its pegs. The weight was familiar now, an extension of her own will. She walked back out onto the porch, raised the rifle to her shoulder, and took aim. Not at him, but at a fence post just to the right of his horse's head. She breathed out slowly, just as Callum had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion shattered the afternoon quiet. The bullet slammed into the post, sending a spray of splinters into the air. Caleb's horse shrieked and reared, nearly throwing him. He wrestled with the panicked animal, his face a picture of disbelief and sudden, stark fear. He stared at Evelyn, standing on the porch, the rifle held steady in her hands, her expression as hard and unyielding as the land itself. He saw she was not the frightened little bird he had imagined. She was a she-wolf protecting her den. Without another word, he yanked on the reins, turned his terrified horse, and galloped away, not looking back. The moment he was out of sight, a violent tremor ran through Evelyn's body. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She lowered it, her arms shaking, and leaned against the porch post, her knees weak. She had not broken, but the cost of that strength was a fresh understanding of the violence she was capable of. When Callum returned an hour later and she told him what had happened, he said nothing. He simply took the rifle from her hands, then pulled her into an embrace so fierce it almost took her breath away. He held her for a long time, his pride in her a silent, powerful current passing between them. The next day, Evelyn went to the spot where her new garden met the wild prairie. With a small trowel, she dug a hole. She had ordered a single, bare-root rosebush from a catalog, a hardy variety meant to survive the harsh winters. She gently placed it in the earth, packing the soil around its base. This was not a memorial. This was a promise.
She had finally, truly forgiven herself for the loss of her first child. She understood now that it had not been her failure. It had been a tragedy, one of many in a hard life. Her grief for him would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. As she watered the small, thorny plant, she gave it a name. She called it Hope. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, painting the vast sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of sage. Evelyn rested her head on Callum's shoulder, her hand on her belly, where she could feel the faint, fluttering movements of their child. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a feeling of coming home not just to a place, but to herself. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the twilight. The question that had once been born of her deepest fear now resurfaced, but this time it was a whisper of wonder, a confirmation of the miracle they had built together. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice soft and trembling with the weight of her love. "After this? After all of this?" Callum turned and took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in their stormy depths a love as vast and enduring as the sky above them. "Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken emotion, "there's nowhere else I'd ever be." Days later, the first pains began, low and insistent. Her labor started in the deep of night and lasted through the next day. It was a long, arduous journey, but she was not alone. Callum was with her, a constant, steady presence. He held her hand, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and murmured words of encouragement, his strength her anchor. Sarah Miller was there, her calm competence a reassuring guide through the waves of pain. Evelyn fought with a strength she never knew she possessed, a primal force driving her forward. And then, just as the first pale light of dawn broke over the eastern hills, a new cry filled the small cabin, a thin, wavering, but gloriously alive sound. A baby girl was born. Sarah cleaned her and wrapped her in a soft blanket, placing her in Evelyn's waiting arms. Evelyn wept as she held her daughter, tears of exhaustion, of relief, of a love so fierce and overwhelming it felt as if her heart would burst. She had a child in her arms again, and this time there was no dream, no fading away. This was real. Callum stood beside the bed, his face a wreck of tears and awe. He touched the baby's tiny, perfect hand, his large, rough finger dwarfed by hers. Later, after Evelyn had rested, he gently lifted their daughter and carried her across the room. He placed her in the cradle he had built, the pale pine glowing in the morning light. She fit perfectly. They stood over the cradle, side by side, their arms around each other, looking down at the new life they had created. "What should we name her?" Evelyn whispered. Callum looked from the baby's peaceful, sleeping face to his wife's, and he thought of all they had endured. He thought of the grace they had been given, the second chances, the forgiveness they had found in each other. "Mercy," he said, his voice thick. "Let's call her Mercy." The story ends there, but it also begins. It ends with the three of them on the porch in the days that followed, watching the vast, open horizon. A family, not one born of convenience or contract, but one forged in the fires of tragedy, tempered by resilience, and finally, blessedly, bound by a love as strong and enduring as the land itself. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.